The tradition of a last meal before execution has a long and debated history. Still, it's become a pop culture phenomenon in the US. With some states allowing freedom of choice and others imposing strict limits, inmates' final food requests vary widely. While most choose comfort foods and desserts, some opt for something symbolic, random, or weird. These peculiar last meals have become integral to death row lore, often discussed long after the executions. Let's dive into this video to know some of the strangest last meal requests ever. Here we begin. Bruno Richard Hauptmann. Narrowing down a last meal order to a single dish can be a challenge for inmates, given the gravity of the decision. As a result, many prisoners opt for various favorite foods, including Bruno Richard Hauptmann. However, Hauptmann's meal is particularly peculiar because many of the items he requested don't necessarily complement each other. Hauptmann rose to notoriety in the 1930s for his role in the infamous Lindbergh kidnapping case. He allegedly abducted toddler Charles Lindbergh Jr. and demanded a ransom of $50,000. He was later sentenced to death for the boy's murder, despite maintaining his innocence until the end. Prison officials allowed Hauptmann to choose any food for his last meal, and he selected French fries and chicken, typical last meal items. However, he also asked for cherries, olives, buttered peas, and plain celery, a seemingly random assortment of vegetables that don't necessarily pair well. Finally, for dessert, he requested a single piece of cake. Philip Ray Workman. Philip Ray Workman stood out from other death row inmates with his last meal request, using it as a unique opportunity to make amends. Despite receiving a death sentence in Tennessee for shooting a police officer during a robbery, Workman expressed remorse for his crime and raised doubts about his guilt, spending over 25 years in prison before exhausting all appeals. Then, before his execution in 2007, he ordered a vegetarian pizza with an unusual stipulation: it should be delivered to a random homeless person in the area. Although prison officials denied his request, Workman's selfless choice inspired others to take action. Many Tennesseans raised money or ordered pizzas for homeless shelters, feeding hundreds of people the same day Workman died. In addition, Donna Spangler convinced friends to purchase a $1,200 pizza for Nashville's rescue mission. As a result, the Workman's last meal request became a unique opportunity for redemption, inspiring a wave of community outreach. Stacy Lawton. In 2000, Stacy Lawton's last meal request stood out for its unique choice of toppings. While a cheeseburger with fries is a common fast food meal, Lawton added a jar of dill pickles. The salty and sour flavor of the pickles complemented the burger well, but consuming an entire jar of pickles in one sitting is no easy feat. Nonetheless, Lawton insisted that his last meal wouldn't be complete without this massive helping of pickles. Lawton was sentenced to death in 1992 after being apprehended by the police following a high-speed chase in a stolen pickup truck. He received a death penalty for his involvement in a robbery and the fatal shooting of a man outside his home. Although Lawton maintained his innocence, his conviction appeals were unsuccessful during his 7 years on death row. He was executed in Texas in 2000, and his unusual last meal request has been remembered ever since. Timothy McVeigh. Last meals can reveal much about a person's life, and Timothy McVeigh's final request was no exception. The Oklahoma City bomber didn't opt for a fancy or elaborate Last Supper, but chose a simple favorite from childhood. The night before his execution in 2001, McVeigh requested 2 chocolate chip ice creams. It's a comfort food choice that many can relate to, but for McVeigh, it would be his last indulgence before his death. His bombing of a federal building in 1995 remains the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in U.S. history, ensuring that his name and crimes will never be forgotten. Yet, even after his death, people still study his final meal, trying to understand the man behind the heinous act. James Edward Smith. While many death row inmates opt for unconventional last meals, James Edward Smith's final request was unique. Smith, a self-proclaimed voodoo priest who received the death penalty for murder, ordered a dump of Ryakunda dirt for a ritual to help his spirit pass on after death. However, prison officials denied his request, and Smith settled for a cup of prepackaged yogurt. Despite its lackluster taste, Smith warned guards before his execution that his spirit would haunt the prison for 300 years, indicating his determination to make an impact. Ultimately, Smith's request for dirt may have been strange, but it demonstrated his strong beliefs and commitment to his faith. Kenneth Wayne Morris. Kenneth Wayne Morris celebrated his 38th birthday on death row by requesting a white cake with lemon icing. Morris ate fried chicken and fried okra for his last meal, along with his birthday dessert. The Texas prison served his final meal at lunchtime, and Morris was executed early that evening. Morris had been a career criminal before his conviction, with a long history of burglary and violent crimes. He received a death penalty for his involvement in a home invasion that resulted in the murder of one of the homeowners. Despite his two accomplices receiving lighter sentences, Morris received the maximum penalty for his role in the killing. Morris exhausted all his appeal options at the state and U.S. Supreme Court levels and spent approximately 15 years in prison. Charles Rumbaugh. Charles Rumbaugh, a convicted murderer and robber, had a surprising last meal request before his execution. While many death row inmates opt for extravagant and indulgent meals, Rumbaugh chose a simple flour tortilla with only a glass of water. Flour tortillas are usually versatile ingredients that can be filled with various ingredients, but Rumbaugh wanted nothing else but the plain taste of the tortilla. Researcher David Tomsevich believes that this seemingly strange request reflected Rumbaugh's philosophical nature and his lack of desire for an extravagant meal. However, with much more significant things on his mind in his final days, Rumbaugh's last meal choice remains a fascinating and memorable part of his story on death row. John William Elliott. Regarding their last meal, some criminals opt for simplicity, choosing their favorite dishes or a special treat. However, John Williams Elliott's final request was highly specific. He asked for a cup of hot tea made with tea bags and 6 chocolate chip cookies to accompany it. While this order may seem unremarkable, it appears to have been carefully thought out. Elliott was executed by lethal injection in 2003, nearly 20 years after his conviction for the brutal murder of a young woman in the late 1980s. He was sentenced to death by a Texas court after his 2 accomplices testified against him. Although he held British and American citizenship, he granted interviews only to British media outlets during his time in prison. Despite support for his execution in Texas, Elliott's sentence was widely opposed in Britain. His choice of tea and cookies as his last meal could have been a nostalgic nod to his childhood, spent on a U.S. military base in Great Britain. Victor Figure. The desire for a final taste of comfort food is a common motivation for many death row inmates as they wait for their execution. However, for some, the selection of their last meal is driven by philosophy rather than gastronomy. One such example is Victor Figure, who in the 1960s faced the death penalty in Iowa for kidnapping and murdering a local doctor. Figure's infamy stems from being the last criminal executed in Iowa before the state abolished capital punishment in 1965. Rather than request a sumptuous meal, Figure chose a solitary olive with its spit intact. His decision was influenced by the symbolism of olives, which are often associated with peace. However, Figure's request for an olive with a pit was particularly unusual, as he hoped to sow an olive tree from his grave. Nevertheless, the prison authorities granted a simpler request shortly before his execution, and after his death. The olive's pit was found in his burial suit. While Figure's meal choice may have had more spiritual significance than culinary appeal, it still captivates those interested in the habits of those facing the death penalty. Gerald Lee Mitchell. Gerald Lee Mitchell's last meal choice may have been unusual but undoubtedly memorable. While candy is not typically a meal, Mitchell selected a bag of Jolly Rancher candies as his final food request. This seemingly childlike decision may have held some significance to the 17-year-old murderer, who openly admitted to killing 3 people with a shotgun. Despite his youth during his crimes, Texas law permitted a death sentence for Mitchell. As a result, he spent nearly half his life on death row before being executed at 33. Whether he could finish the entire bag of Jolly Ranchers before his death is unknown. While candy may not be a suitable substitute for a full meal, Mitchell's choice reminds us of the unique and personal significance behind each prisoner's final food request. It also highlights the solemnity of the occasion and the weight of the consequences of their actions. So, what do you think of these prisoners' last meal requests on death row? Comment below and subscribe for more.